The wind cut sharp through the narrow cracks in the line shack, threading its icy fingers beneath the worn wood like it belonged there. Gideon pulled his collar tighter around his neck and leaned closer to the tiny stove, sputtering orange glows in the corner. The long winter had been the kind of hard that forced a man to reckon not with others, but with himself. Frozen, silent land, stretched all around him, brittle and unyielding as the man who'd carved his claim out of the Montana wilderness. The mountains loomed distant, their snow-capped ridges scouring the gray sky with whispered menace. He'd spent years proving the land would bend, that the earth would yield, that a man could make a home here. But proving it right took every ounce of grit and quiet patience he had. Each morning, the shack greeted him with the same rough welcome. Frost-slick windows dulled the light from outside into pale shards that fractured the stillness. His breath clouded in shallow puffs as he moved inside, the scent of wood smoke, worn leather, and the lingering musk of cattle mingling faintly in the room. Outside, skeletal branches scratched and rattled against the frozen ground. He liked to imagine the land wasn't entirely empty, that it listened, that it watched. It was his companion, unblinking and unyielding. The cold was a measure of his solitude, and his own wide shadow stretched long across the land in the low winter sun. Gideon didn't mind the cold, didn't mind the isolation. He preferred the slow rhythm of clear days and bitter nights, the steady work, silence. It had been a hard winter in more ways than one, each day folding into the next like an endless ledger of chores and quiet endurance. His calloused hands, tipped with grime and fine scars, traced the edge of the stove one last time before turning to fetch the bucket of frozen water outside. The scrape of iron shoes against the hard-packed snow was the only sound beyond the occasional creak of the shack settling into its own weight. He heard the faint jingle of harness bells on a distant trail, the only sign that life beyond his land stirred. The line territory was rough, solid land, a patch of earth that swallowed the hard work of a man and gave back the barest promise of plenty. Gideon had worked it with patient hands, breaking up stubborn ground and fixing fences pressed down by heavy snows. The winter proved long, yet his resolve remained steadfast. Work was prayer. It was the quiet promise of a future carved in scraped knuckles and sweat frozen on his skin. It was just as he was about to return inside to warm his fingers and sip the bitter coffee left in his tin cup when he saw it dust twisting faint against the winter haze. A slow thud of hooves against rough track, then the sudden jarring halt of a wagon. The silhouette was alone in the frozen expanse, the wagon wheels kicking up frozen mud and fragments of brittle grass. Gideon's grip tightened on the cup. The stranger was not unwelcome, though he rarely welcomed company. On the porch, his broad shoulders tensed as he watched the solitary figure step from the wagon. Beulah! He didn't know her name then, or if he would ever speak it aloud only. The slightness of her frame against the vast endurance of winter. A woman who didn't seem swayed by the bitter cold or plaintive wind. The dim light of late afternoon framed her like a statue of defiance. A chestnut braid hung loose against her back, the heavy dust of the trail clinging to her worn boots and faded skirts. She strode around the broken wagon wheel, inspecting it with a keen eye that held no trace of pleading. The faint scar above her left eyebrow caught the light, scarred but steadfast, proof of battles neither easily forgotten nor spoken of. For an endless moment, Gideon could only watch from the shadows of his porch. She was a figure of grit, rigid with a quiet pride that refused help like a shield. Her lean hands, weather-worn but sure, traced the jagged break in the wooden wheel. She pulled a leather strap from her belt and tapped it against the spokes softly, as though trying to coax the thing back into life by sheer will. The wagon which had carried her for miles through dust and cold now lay crippled beneath the weight of its burden. "I don't reckon you're getting anywhere against that like it is," Gideon said at last, stepping forward into the amber light. His voice was low, steady, without accusation or expectation. Beulah's gray-green eyes flicked up sharply, sizing him with a reserve sharpened by years alone. The flush of cold and exertion colored her cheeks, but she held her gaze steady, like a wild horse tethered only by familiarity. "I'll manage," she said, voice roughened by travel and the drought of trust. "No need for offers. I've got it under control." The words were clipped, a shield raised before any kindness could reach her guard. Gideon nodded slowly, sensing the honest stubbornness beneath the armor. "The road ahead's frozen hard. Might not be wise to break your wagon's back on your own right now." He gestured toward the wheel. "Name's Gideon. I keep to this land round here. If you'll let me, I could lend a hand." Beulah's jaw tightened, then softened against the relentless cold and weariness she barely showed. She hesitated, long enough for the wind to swell and whip the dust around her, swirling in fine clouds that danced about her boots. Her hands scrabbled briefly at the wagon's frame, fingers trembling with chill despite years of labor. "I said I don't need help," Beulah replied, but there was something quieter in her tone, a tremor beneath the tough edge. "I've done fine on my own before." Gideon didn't press, sensing the hard line wasn't about pride alone. It was protection. A woman hardened by solitude to the point where accepting aid felt like a fracture in the carefully built walls of self-reliance. "Sometimes a man works alone for a lifetime and still ain't ready to admit when he needs a hand," Gideon said quietly. "Won't push it. If you want, I'll be nearby. Just holler." Beulah glanced briefly around the bleak sweep of Montana prairie, where trees were few and the sky stretched vast and indifferent. The silence between them hung thick, filled with unspoken stories. Stories of roads walked alone, winters endured, and the brittle ache of wanting without yet daring to ask. Slowly, reluctantly, Beulah folded her arms and rested her back against the side of the wagon, breath visible in fat clouds against the cold. The warmth of the shack behind Gideon seemed worlds away from the biting frost she braved. In that icy stillness, two solitary shapes stood apart yet drawn toward the fragile promise of company. The wind sighed between them, a thin thread of wild Montana winter wind that swept across the frozen landscape, like a reminder that even in the harshest cold, the land held stories waiting for hearts brave enough to listen. She might have said she needed no one, but when the wagon stopped on his road, something deeper began unraveling in quiet tension, a softness beneath the steady, weathered gaze that neither dared voice yet. Gideon tipped his worn leather hat back, the slow creak of leather folding like a beacon. "I'll keep a fire going if you decide you're done fighting the cold for one night," he said. No one should have to brave the dark alone. Beulah met his eyes then, gray and resolute, and in their quiet depths was something unspoken, not weakness, not surrender, only the faintest flicker of a possibility neither had promised, but both felt stirring beneath the frost. "Maybe," she said quietly. And with that single word, fragile as drifting snow, the winter stretched on, still cold, still wide and unforgiving, but somehow less empty, less alone. The wagon might have stopped on his road, but something else, sterner and softer both, had begun moving in the space between them. The fire's glow caught on the hollows of Beulah's face as she settled close to the bed of crackling embers, the dry pine needles and splintered wood burning slow and steady against the cold Montana night. The warmth seeped into her worn fingers and up her arms, softening the ache that had tightened like a coil in her chest all day. Outside the fragile ring of orange light, the world was a vast, silent shadow that crept toward her, black, endless, and indifferent. Yet here she was, alone against it, but not quite untouched. The fire's steady heartbeat spoke to her, a call she hadn't been certain she could trust anymore. The wagon sat just beyond the firelight, its wood groaning faintly as the cold seeped into every joint and crevice, its weary wheels trapped in the rutted earth like a stubborn beast refusing to budge. Beulah's hands hovered near the flames, warming knuckles raw from packing and laboring, fingers twitching with that restless impulse to keep busy even when fatigue begged otherwise. She pulled her coat tighter, feeling the rough wool scratch against her neck, a reminder that she'd never been one for softness, either given or taken. Her eyelids fluttered in the quiet lull, half shut against the cold and the loneliness that, though familiar, pressed heavy tonight. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a distant wolf howled, a raw, lonesome sound that sent a thin shudder through her spine. She swallowed it down, stubborn pride rising like a shield. Adarisk, I need no one. I survive alone. Asterisk. But even as the thought armored her, a tiny crack of doubt tipped the edges, fragile as frost under morning sun. Morning shadow bled slowly across the snow-dusted ground when Beulah stirred, awaking to the chill biting, sharper than it had before. Gone was the fire, but not the faint scent of smoke clinging to the pines. Her breath wove into mist as she moved stiffly, eyes flickering to the earth just beyond the wagon's wheels. And there, just past the rim of the fire's last warmth, recent disturbance marked the ground, a pile of fresh water skins and a small cloth bundle tied tight. She stood, cautious, wary, scanning the stillness for signs of anyone's presence. The bundle unwrapped revealed a loaf of bread, still warm and gold-encrusted, wrapped in oilskins so well that moisture within had softened the crust to inviting tenderness. Her gaze crept back toward the edge of Gideon's property, the small cabin tucked into the brush like a secret. No note, no announcement, just the bread and water, a quiet offering breathed into the morning stillness like a silent prayer. Her fingers lingered over the leather strap of the water skin, heart tugged between gratitude and the fear of dependence. Two strangers balanced on a fragile line. Beulah didn't rush into the warmth of the cabin or the company of another man's kindness. Instead, she settled near the wagons, nibbling the bread as carefully as if it might shatter, washing its sharp sweetness down with water so cold it burned the throat. That simple break-a-meal born from human hands felt like a thread pulling tighter across the expanse of wilderness that separated her from another's world. She wasn't used to being given care, certainly not without price or expectation. Still, the bread had tasted like possibility. It wasn't until midday, when the sun climbed hesitantly over frost-locked branches, that Beulah stepped from the shelter of the wagon toward the cabin. Her hands were stained with grease and earth from her labor on the stubborn broken wheel, her boots scuffed from the frozen mud and roots she had wrestled with clumsily. The bread had vanished into her satchel, half saved, half eaten in moments of hunger and exhaustion, but the warmth inside her was something softer, something quieter, drawing her forward. Gideon stood by the cabin's door, his frame tall against the wide Montana sky, shadowed and steady. His soft brown eyes met hers with the same slow, patient kindness he had shown the night before, but now they held open a door she wasn't sure she was ready to walk through. She hesitated, fingers curling around the missing pieces of her pride. "Thank you," she said quietly, voice rough as dry silk. No pretense, no offering of friendship, only a simple acknowledgement. "For the water." And the bread. She tucked her chin slightly against the sharp light, lest he see the flicker of vulnerability she tried hard to hide. Gideon dipped his head with a slow smile that didn't press or plead. "Figured you could use it." His voice was the kind of low rumble that softened the hard edges of the world. "Ain't no shame in accepting a little help." Beulah's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in quiet defense. "I don't need favors." "No favors," Gideon said, stepping forward, but keeping distance like a line he'd learned not to cross. "Just company, if you want it." for a heartbeat. Both lingered in the open air between them. The wind tugged at the hem of Gideon's coat, carrying with it the scent of pine smoke and earth. Beulah's gaze softened, just barely enough that Gideon saw the question lurking beneath the deflections. She gestured toward her wagon, its wheel crudely lashed with rope against the broken spokes. "I'm fixing her," she said simply, as if the declaration of repair might build a wall strong enough against the quiet pull of one more presence. "It'd be easier with two," Gideon offered, voice steady but without push. "No rush on my end." Beulah turned away. Flesh tight with the strain of old habits, born of solitude and strength, honed against an unforgiving land. Yet her steps slowed as she lifted a lantern from the wagon's side, the flickering flame, a fragile rebellion against dusk. She glanced back once into the high shadows. Where Gideon stood, the softening lines of his face caught in a golden pool of late afternoon sun. The wagon creaked as she knelt beside it, muscles braced against cold, fingers moving with measured patience. Each stubborn nail and splintered spoke a silent challenge. She met with rolling grit that had shaped her through years of hard living. Gideon hovered nearby, silent but present, a quiet guardian without assumption, offering steady hands when called but never intruding. Beulah caught the glimpses of him out of the corner of her eye, the deliberate way he squatted by the firewood, the slow stretches of broad shoulders beneath a dusted leather coat. She wondered briefly if he saw in her the same trace of strength, wrapped tightly in brittle layers that she saw in him. Two solitary figures, each carrying ghosts and scars no one else was meant to shoulder. The fire blinked alive again that evening as she fed it dry scraps from the wagon's undercarriage hands, trembling not from cold, but from something she refused to name. Gideon had left more food and water wrapped and waiting, nestled beneath a thick clump of sagebrush. Beulah ate in small bites, the simple courtesy no longer a burden, but a small bridge spanning the abyss of loneliness. "Don't have to sit there and pretend you don't want company," Gideon said suddenly as she bent over to stoke the fire. The words were soft, but the tone had a gentle honesty that coaxed rather than demanded. Beulah paused, the small stick frozen between fingers, and lifted her eyes to meet his. "I don't pretend." "Then maybe you'll pretend with me just a little," he said, voice lighter now, laced with humor. "A fire's warmer with two." Her lips twitched in a ghost of a smile, an admission as fragile as the frost on the window panes of his cabin. "Maybe," she echoed, the single word hanging between them like the first crack of dawn, fragile enough to fade, but stubborn enough to hold promise. So the night folded around two figures huddled near firelight, the cold Montana winter shrinking its vastness, the silence deepening into something richer, a shared presence, the quiet communion of people who had learned that sometimes survival meant letting the walls fall away, if only just enough to catch one warm breath beside another. That night Beulah slept closer to the fire than she had planned, the warmth lingering against her skin like a balm. Gideon's cabin stood silent and watchful behind her, a shelter, not just of wood and stone, but of something more elusive, a tentative space where two hardened souls might begin to lower their defenses. And in the great wide country where trust was the rarest commodity, a seed was sown quietly beneath the frost and beneath the stars. Days bled quietly into one another, the Montana light brushing across the rutted road and spreading in wide lenticular blooms over rolling hills where sagebrush whispered secrets to the sky. Each dawn carried the same dim breath, cold and distant, with a slow, inevitable unfurling of clouds and sun, dust and distant hills melting gold on the horizon. In those endless hours gone was the urgency of a broken wagon or the shyness of strangers. Instead, something simpler, more profound, nestled between the grooves of their routine. Gideon became an almost ghostly presence at Beulah's door. Every morning when she roused herself from the thin cot by the cabin's small window, There, without word or fuss, sat tiny offerings laid out, with a care that only the most cautious of hopes can hold. A stone smoothed by wind and river, midnight black and heavy in her palm, a bundle of jerky, smoky and tough. With a hint of sage, a tightly wrapped cloth of wildflower seed pods, promising something small to nurture and keep. These gifts were humbly placed by her doorframe, near the worn wooden steps that creaked beneath her weight whenever she descended to begin the day's chores. At first, Beulah tolerated these tokens with the reserve of one who shields skin newly healed from a too bright sun. Her fingers brushed the gifts only long enough to confirm their presence before setting them down again, deliberately more distant than close, reluctant to admit the weight they carried for her. But in the folds of such hesitant gratitude, her gaze began to stray, wandering past her immediate tasks to the landscape beyond, the rolling hills, the fences frayed by frost and time, the scattering of pines that whispered of solitude and watchfulness. And there, too, her eyes sought Gideon, where he moved with the slow deliberateness of a man who owned not just the land, but its quiet secrets. There was a rhythm in his steps, a steady cadence that seemed to mark time by some obscure internal clock. He was always out before the sun had fully raised its face, a sturdy frame silhouetted against the blush of dawn. He pushed the faded wooden gate open gently, as though coaxing the land itself awake, and wandered along the fence lines or into the secret hollows where the cold pressed hardest against the earth. Gradually, in silent intervals, punctuated by the occasional low murmur to himself, Gideon's presence grew less like a shadow and more like the slow, sure line of a river carving its way across rocky soil. Beulah found herself glancing towards him more often, a stolen look across the patchwork of snow and brown grass, over fences that divided but could not truly separate. Each time, the faintest quickening came to her chest, a complicated pulse that she tried to deny and understand all at once. It felt like an unsettled tether, a reticent thread pulling her attention despite her guarded nature and carefully sculpted independence. She told herself these moments were brief and unremarkable, the kind of distraction a woman alone on the frontier might grant herself without consequence. Yet beneath this pragmatic dismissal, there stirred something more fragile, something she recognized from a long-buried place inside, a need for connection, for warmth that was not merely from fire or work, but from the shared breath of another human, a companion to witness the slow drift of days. One particularly sharp morning, the frost hung heavy and brittle over the fields, a thin white glaze turning the silhouettes of dry grasses into fine etchings against the earth. Gideon had been out before daylight, fording the creek and inspecting fence posts under the gray wash of a low sky. The wind cut through layers of wool and leather, sharp enough to sting cheeks and redden fingertips despite gloves, but he moved steadily, methodically. Beulah was tending the meager vegetable patch behind the cabin, the soil stubborn and reluctant beneath her fingers, when she heard the subtle snap of broken wood from the northern fence line, a faint complaint in the quiet air. She tightened her grip on the hoe and straightened, shading her eyes against the weak sun as she looked across the field. There, Gideon knelt beside the fence, already assessing the damage. A weathered post had wobbled loose, its base ravaged by the frost and shifting earth. He didn't call for her or seek permission. His hands reached toward the post, steady and sure, lifting and adjusting as though it had been a trivial task for years. Beulah felt something stir in her chest, a mix of surprise and a reluctant, budding gratitude. The tension that had woven its way between pride and need found a cracking seam as she watched him work silently. She could have fetched a tool or helped, but something about the way Gideon moved, quiet, uncomplicated, as if helping was neither burden nor favor, lulled her defenses into a brief surrender. "Don't suppose you want a hand?" she called across the distance, her voice more tentative than she intended. He looked up, then, brushing dirt from calloused fingers, the faint hint of a slow, easy smile catching at the corners of his mouth. "Got it from here," he said, voice low and steady. "But thanks, Beulah." His name on his lips struck something warmer inside her, a note softer and more personal than the usual quiet salutation or passing. She allowed herself to smile then, a rare, almost shy movement that thankfully betrayed none of the tumult beneath the surface. "Just don't let the cattle break the fence again," she teased, the old protective thread in her tone mixing with a newfound softness. Gideon chuckled, a sound like the creak of old leather settling into place. "I'll keep an eye on 'em. They're clever as foxes, sometimes." For a moment, they stood there, the warmth of shared space settling between them like a faint glow after the cold. Beulah shifted her weight, arms loosely crossed, feeling the bones of her resolve tremble in the quiet intimacy of the moment. "You know," she said, voice dropping, "I didn't expect you to help. Not without asking, anyway." He tipped his hat back slightly, catching a stray lock of sandy hair in the sharp light. "Maybe there's more to this road than just strangers passing through," he said, eyes steady on hers. "Sometimes help means just showing up where it's needed, whether it's asked for or not." The sentiment, soft and unspoken for so long, hung between them like the warm sun over the frozen earth, tentative, dangerous, and undeniable. Beulah's laugh was quiet, heartfelt, unfolding in a moment of gentle release. "Well, maybe I'm learning," she admitted, the words carrying an uncharacteristic lightness, like the breaking of an old rusted hinge. "Good," Gideon said, stepping closer so the distance between them shrank to the width of shared breath. "You'll let me fix one of those wheels, too." Her eyes met his, then the texture of late winter dawn curling quietly in their depths. She swallowed, feeling the raw edges of old defenses soften into something that might be called trust, or perhaps something even rarer, the simple, unguarded permission to lean in just a fraction. "Maybe I will," she said finally, the promise feather-light but weighty, with everything neither dared say aloud. And, in the great expanse of place and silence, beneath the open Montana sky, two people stood close enough now to hear the slow beat of a heart marching steady, firm towards something new, a quiet belonging that no journey, broken wagon, or deliberate solitude could ever have summoned alone. The afternoon sun hung low and honeyed, casting long shadows over the yawning stretch of Montana prairie that rolled beyond the shattered edges of the road. The wind, gentle yet insistent, wove through the dry grass, carrying with it the faint sweet bite of sagebrush and the dust-choked memory of a summer long past. Beulah stood with her hands parked on her hips, the grit beneath her nails baked stiff from hauling the last load of firewood, the rhythmic scrape of splitting logs still lingering in her muscles. She was quiet still, feeling the warmth seeping slowly through her skin as the day leaned into dusk. Her eyes scanned the horizon, distant and sharp, while her mind churned slowly, tangled in the weight of an unexpected offering she wasn't yet certain she was ready to accept. Then, as if pulled from the air itself, a small voice reached out, tentative, curious. "Hey, Gideon," came the call, as clear and abrupt as a whistle across the fields. Beulah's pulse fluttered unevenly, and her head turned toward the figure, bounding toward them along a patchy, dusty trail. A boy no older than 7 or 8, face freckled and sunburnt, hair the color of ripe wheat, eyes lively and unguarded. He wore worn-out boots, too large for his feet, and a shirt that had seen better summers. In his hands he clutched a smooth, knobby stick, which he waved wildly as he approached. "The man who cares!" The boy grinned, eyes bright with the simple fondness children often have for names that stick, especially names earned in quiet acts. Gideon shifted his stance, but smiled down at the boy, the corners of his mouth tugging upward with a warmth that didn't come easily, but when it did, it shone softly like embers glowing beneath ash. "The man who cares." Gideon's voice was low. roughened by years of dust and wind, but pleasantly shaded with amusement. "Sounds like a title I'm not allowed to lose?" The boy laughed, a clear, ringing sound that danced up and away in the lightning air. "Well, my ma says you're the one folks can count on, and that's saying something around here." Beulah watched from a little distance, her arms folding tight across her chest, the muscles in her jaw nodding briefly. The boy's words echoed in her mind longer than she liked. The man who cares. Those simple words carried a weight so different than the one she'd carried for herself all these years. Self-reliance, indifference, the sharp edge of need no one. The idea of letting that image bruise and yield to the possibility of care. Her eyes flicked down to her weathered hands, hands made rough by years of scrabbling, alone, mending, pushing forward in a world that didn't much care whether she succeeded or failed. The sight of those hands, scarred, knotted, was like a silent reminder. She wasn't used to letting someone see more than the surface. She wasn't used to seeing herself through the eyes of someone who spoke so openly about kindness and quiet strength. A flicker of vulnerability, brief and fast as a sparrow's flight, rattled through her chest. Quickly she tucked it away as if it were a fragile glass vase she dared not hold too long in her grasp. Gideon, watching her from the corner of his eye, noticed the quick tightening around her mouth, the small sigh she tried to stifle. But he said nothing, only offered a steady smile that held no pressure, no expectant weight, just the simple acknowledgement that he saw her, the real her, in the space between their shared moments. He knew that some things had to grow in their own time, not forced or hurried, but tolerated with patience. The boy wagged his stick, eyes bright with the boundless energy of youth, before skipping ahead down the trail, calling back over his shoulder, "See you round, Gideon. And you too, Beulah." "Don't be a stranger." Beulah gave a reluctant nod, the corners of her mouth twitching up to spite herself, and watched the boy's figure blur into the swirling dust of the road behind him. The quiet stretched again, a new kind of space softening within her, a liminal place between the hard loneliness she'd always known and the fragile cusp of something gentler. "I reckon he's not wrong," Gideon said softly, stepping closer again, though leaving respectful distance between them. "Help don't have to be big. Sometimes it's just showing up. Like I said earlier." Beulah's eyes met his, the weight of unspoken truths hanging between them. She swallowed, feeling the old walls inside her tremble, but not yet fall. "Maybe so," she said quietly, voice rougher than the air between them. "Maybe. It's harder than I thought." Gideon's slow smile deepened, the kind that radiated warmth into cold spaces. "That's the truth. But the harder it is to trust, the more it's worth holding on to when you find it." A gentle silence settled as twilight knifed through the fading sky, the chorus of cicadas rising with the dark. There was a pause, as if the world itself was giving them a moment to breathe, to rethink the shape of their lives and what might fit inside those shapes now. After a long moment, Beulah turned back toward the tangle of cut wood stacked by the wagon. "You want to stay for supper?" she asked, the words barely above a whisper, but charged with a surprising vulnerability. Gideon blinked, genuinely taken by the offer. The invitation wasn't just about food. It was an opening, a crossing of a threshold. Neither of them had anticipated that first day. Her wagon broke down. "I'd like that," he said, voice low and steady. "A good meal sounds like just what I need after hauling all that firewood." Beulah gave a faint, genuine smile, something rare and precious that felt like sunlight slipping through the cracks in a shuttered window. The two of them worked side by side as the daylight bled slowly out of the sky, gathering the last of the firewood, their movements practiced, but not automatic anymore. There was no rush, no urgency, just quiet companionship built in the back-and-forth rhythm of shared labor. Their breaths came in time with the rising smoke from the small fire Beulah built near the wagon, curling against the purple dusk. filling the space with the sharp scent of dry pine needles and toasted earth. The supper was simple, a modest stew of beans, what little salt pork Beulah had managed to scrounge from the nearby general store last week, yet the act of sitting down to share it transformed the air around them. There was a focusing of light in the simple ritual, the way a spark catches dry tinder, the steam rising from the rough, hand-thrown ceramic bowl, the warmth of the fire flickering over Gideon's lined face, the low hum of night settling deep into the surrounding pines. Beulah spooned out a second helping, her hand steady despite the nervous curving of her throat. "Eat while it's warm," she said, eyes avoiding his for just a breath, but then daring to meet his steady gaze. "Folks don't usually linger long here when the sun dips low." Gideon nodded, catching a glimmer of that flicker she tried so hard to bury, the soft vulnerability that betrayed her fierce self-reliance, but he didn't say a word to disturb it. Instead, he gave her a look of pure, steady appreciation, as though her invitation was a sacred act, a quiet offering of trust wrapped in the crackle and glow of firelight. "Thanks, Beulah," he said simply, voice low and full. It's more than just a meal. It's company." She nodded slowly, breathing in the scent of pine smoke and supper, feeling the hint of something fragile and new nestled in the warm ache behind her ribs. "I guess sometimes company's just what we need, even if it's the kind we never think to ask for." Their meal passed in easy silence, punctuated only by the occasional crackle of burning wood and the rustling of grass stirred by the evening breeze. As shadows deepened, Beulah felt the walls she had built so carefully around herself shift just enough to let a small sliver of hope seep inside. The fear didn't disappear. It never did. But for the first time in years, it didn't feel quite so sharp, so solitary, so impenetrable. After supper, Gideon reached for his hat, setting it on his knee as he gazed up at the starlit canopy overhead. "You ever miss it?" he asked, suddenly quiet, like the turning of a secret over in his mouth. "The world being a little less lonely?" Beulah considered the question, the honest ache it held. Her eyes swept the vast Montana sky, the constellations wheeling slow and sure above the foothills. "I do," she admitted, voice small and unsteady. "More than I ever let myself say." Gideon smiled then, a slow unfolding that crinkled the corners of his soft brown eyes. "Well, maybe this road isn't so lonely anymore, if you let it be." A shiver of warmth, like the echo of a long-lost song, rippled through Beulah's chest. She looked at him again, really looked, and something between them settled, quiet, firm, and true. As the night deepened, the fire cracked low, and the wide Montana sky wove its ancient tapestry above two people who had, against the odds and their own stubborn hearts, begun to find a new kind of belonging. The fire had dwindled to sleepy embers, and the night pressed itself close, cool, and persistent beneath the vast Montana sky. Gideon shifted, the worn leather of his hat creaking softly as he rested it on his knee again. His gaze was steady, tracing the stars above as if searching for some answer among the constellations. The moment hung between them, fragile and real, the kind of quiet that begs for truth without demand. After a long breath that seemed to gather courage from the shadows, Gideon looked at Beulah with something rare and unguarded in his eyes. "I stayed through the last winter," he said, voice low, like he was speaking into the hush of the night. "Not just because I had to, but because I wanted to. Wanted to earn my place. This land, this road, it wasn't always kind. Some winters, the wind howls like it means something, like it's a test." His fingers absently traced the rim of his hat, calloused from years of work and worry. Beulah watched him, the faint scar above her eyebrow catching the starlight, a small testament to battles fought and survived. "Earning your place," she murmured, the words soft but steady. "Sounds like a hard thing to reckon with." Gideon's slow smile carried an unspoken understanding. It was. It still is. But staying when the cold bites deep, when the world feels like it don't want much to do with you, that's where I learned who I was and who I wasn't. Silence fell, but it was not empty. It was filled with the weight of truths, folded into the night air, the kind only spoken when the walls lean close enough to hear breathing on the other side. Beulah's fingers twined together in her lap, weathered hands steady despite the tremor that hovered just beneath her skin. I chose to be alone for years, she confessed, voice nearly swallowed by the wind. Not because I liked the loneliness, but because it felt safer that way. Safer than relying on somebody else and having them fail you or leave you after. I told myself it was about strength, about not needing anyone. But her words caught a delicate crack in the armor she'd worn for so long. But it was lonely, Gideon. More than I wanted to say out loud, he turned to her, eyes softening in the firelight, reflecting 1,000 untold stories. Ain't nobody as strong as they want the world to believe. We all carry pieces that hurt, even if we don't show it. Listening to him, to the quiet honesty lacing his voice, something settled inside Beulah, a tiny ember of connection that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with being seen in a way that was safe, even welcome. I'm tired, she admitted after a moment. Voice low. Tired of fighting shadows no one else can see. Sometimes I think maybe I was just afraid I wouldn't know who I was if I let someone else in enough to change me. Change ain't so bad, Gideon said, shaking his head gently, his smile slow and real. Sometimes it's the kindness of somebody else that shows you who you really are. Beulah turned her eyes back to the sky. The vastness both daunting and liberating. I don't know how to do this, she whispered, coming back from everything I told myself about needing no one. You don't have to know all at once, he said softly. We can just start with the quiet, the small things, like sitting here together, not needing to fix or explain. His hand moved, hesitated, then settled a careful inch closer to hers. Not demanding, not rushing, simply presence. Beulah felt her breath catch, the line between fear and hope thinner than the starlit air between them. Her fingers didn't move away. If anything, they inched closer to the warmth his hand offered. A silent answer nobody dared say aloud yet. Morning spilled soft and golden over the hills, brushing the land with the gentle light of a new day. Beulah's wagon sat repaired, wheels sturdy and ready against the earth, thanks to Gideon's patient hands and quiet skill. The air carried the scent of pine and fresh dew, mingled with the dusty sweetness of the dirt road that had brought her here, had kept her here longer than she expected. She packed meticulously, each movement careful but tinged with a reluctance he couldn't hide. The worn leather sat neatly folded, her rough-spun shirts hung already back inside the wagon's chest, and the tools that had once been lifelines now zipped away into saddlebags. Gideon stood nearby, his broad frame leaning slightly against the fence post, watching. There was no hurry in his eyes, only that stubborn patience that had come like a quiet undercurrent through the days they'd shared. When Beulah looked up, she found him watching her with that same tentative hope flickering there. He took a step forward, his voice just above a whisper. Will you come back next spring? The words hung in the air, fragile and full of promise, like the first bloom after a long winter freeze. Beulah's heart stuttered, a wild thing caught between flight and the strange, steady pull of something new. She hesitated, the past crowding around her like dust stirred by the morning light. Saying yes felt like opening a door she'd nailed shut years ago. Saying no felt like walking away from the unspoken possibility of a different story. But she said nothing. Her silence was a language all its own, thick with meaning and pause. It spoke to a hope not yet ready to claim, to a fear not yet willing to yield. Gideon's eyes softened, a slow understanding folding into the quiet they shared. The breeze lifted the loose strands of her dark chestnut hair, and the faint scar above her brow caught a stray beam of sunlight, an emblem of battles faced, walls erected, and maybe someday soon, walls gently taken down. The road stretched long and lonely behind her, but ahead, just out of reach, just beyond the season, there was a possibility, fragile and real as the morning light. A road that might not be so lonely after all, if she dared to walk it again. The snow melted slow, the way winter always did in those parts, reluctant to cede to warmth, but finally giving in, inch by stubborn inch. The heavy mantle of white that had cloaked the landscape all through the long, biting months began to thin, retreating like a shy guest. The creek, once clogged with ice, now sang beneath a veil of dripping branches, weaving a softer song through the air. It was early spring, and the land smelled wet and wild, a faint peppering of green just peeking through the brown. It was on one such morning, the sky a washed canvas of pale blues and wisps of cloud, that Beulah came back. She wasn't like a whisper or a ghost drifting through the snow. No. She came with purpose, her gait sure as the steps she took onto the worn dirt path that led down to Gideon's cabin. In her hand, she carried a small woven basket, carefully filled with wildflowers. Bluebells bowed in quiet clusters, nodding an indigo hello. Nodding trilliums, delicate and white as a fresh page, and sprigs of wild iris, their slender stalks trembling slightly in the soft breeze. Gideon was outside, his boots crunching on the gravel as he splintered wood for the day's fires. He didn't hear her at first, absorbed in the rhythm of his work, until the faint sound of gravel shifting and a soft, familiar voice caught his attention. He looked up, and there she was, Beulah, standing tall with that same lean grace, a hesitant smile touching her lips. Her gray-green eyes searched his face, as if weighing how much want to show. Her dark chestnut hair was pulled back loosely, the strands loose and catching the sun like threads of burnished silk. The faint scar above her left brow was still there, a quiet reminder of the woman who'd endured storms inside and out. But there was something different now, something softer, beneath usual armor. "Morning, Gideon," she said, her words simple, but carrying a warmth that seemed to make the air between them lighter. "Beulah." He set down the hatchet, wiping his hands on a worn cloth. His voice was low but steady. "Never thought I'd see you before the first wildflowers bloomed." She lifted the basket, careful to keep it level like it held something precious, because it did. Figured the flowers might be a good way to say, well, hello again. Her smile was slight but real, arriving slowly like dawn itself. And that small gesture, the basket of wildflowers, the steadying glance, stirred something in Gideon deep beneath his sun-leathered skin. He stepped forward, closing the space with no rush, no urgency, just that deliberate ease of a man who knew how to wait. "Thank you, Beulah. They're real beautiful." His eyes caught the light, soft and sure, in a way that softened the lines on his face. For a heartbeat, the world felt narrow and full all at once, the noisy clamor of doubt and loneliness held at bay by that single shared moment. Their hands brushed, brief, almost accidental, when he reached for the basket, an electric pulse that neither named, but both felt. It was a silent promise, a language spoken in limbs and light. The morning spread wide around them, as if it, too, wanted to watch. She said she needed no one. Gideon had heard those words the year before, echoed at the edges of her goodbyes, tucked beneath the hard shell of her resolve. But the wildflowers, the careful steps back to his cabin, those spoke of something new, a fragile leaning forward, a trust eased open, like spring soil coaxing a root. Spring unfurled quickly after that morning. Days grew long and soft, filled with the quiet hope of new beginnings. They settled into a rhythm, neither had named an easy cadence, born of shared work and simpler kindnesses. Mornings found them side by side along the fertile stretches near the creek, planting and tending the land that Gideon had carved out over years. There was a quiet strength in those hours, the way Beulah's hands, scarred but sure, tilled earth with patience. How Gideon's calloused fingers gently pruned and set seedlings beneath the freshly turned soil. Each task flowed into the next, a choreography born of necessity at first, and then something more, a tacit acknowledgement of belonging. The field smelled of damp earth and wild mint, the sun kissing their backs as they worked without hurry. Sometimes Beulah would hum low songs she'd learned in her youth, the melodies threading through the open air, and Gideon would listen, his soft brown eyes crinkling at the corners, the lines of his slow smile waking fully. "Looks like this patch will bloom fine this year," he'd say, glancing sideways at her, voice low and warm. She'd respond with a nod or a brief lift of her jaw, that quiet approval that held more weight than many words. Those exchanges, small and unadorned, quietly threaded them closer. When the sun dipped low and the work grew done, they'd gather by the fire, built sure and steady near the cabin's stone hearth. The soft glow from the flames painted their faces in shades of ochre and amber, the flickering light tracing their outlines like brushstrokes on a shared canvas. They spoke little, but the silences were fulfilled with embers, with the crackle of burning wood, and with the steady pulse of trust building like a slow river carving through stone. Beulah would lean back against the logs stacked nearby, eyes tracing the stars starting to prick the sky's velvet. Gideon would sit across from her, tipping his worn leather hat back, hands relaxed as he watched the dance of shadows. Sometimes he said a simple thing, a story from the land, a quiet reflection on the weather, or a remembered joke that made her lips twitch just so. Other times, silence stretched long and comfortable, a connection deeper than words. One evening, as the fire smoldered low, Beulah let out a breath she realized she'd been holding. The rhythm of their days, the shared sweat, the tentative smiles, the steady presence had begun to stitch seams where there had been none. She found herself wondering how long it had been since she'd felt a quiet certainty, how long since she'd believed that she might not be alone after all. "Didn't think I'd find this," she started, her voice roughened by the chill and long disuse of such confessions. Not here, not with anyone. Thought the road meant always moving on. Gideon's eyes held hers, a slow knowing unfolding there. "Roads don't always have to lead you away," he said softly. "Sometimes they bring you right where you need to be." Her lips curved, a faint smile that reached deep into her eyes. The words felt heavy. No, not heavy exactly, but real. Shaped by the years she'd carried alone, the weight of battles won and lost inside herself. "Maybe," she said, letting the word float in the cool night air between them. Another pause, the quiet settling around like a shared secret. The stars blinked overhead, bright and unyielding, as if marking that moment, an unspoken turning point where two solitary paths braided finally into one. Mornings repeated themselves, the rhythm steady and kind. They rose with the sun, coffees brewed over the fire, hands busy with the work that the land commanded. Gideon taught Beulah how to read the soil's quiet whispers, the subtle changes that meant rain or drought. She showed him how patience could coax the stiffest seedling to life. Words came easier in the light of day, planning the planting of corn, bidding over which patch might thrive best for late summer berries, laughing quietly over spilled water or stubborn plows. Their gestures became language, a steadying hand on a muddy boot, a quiet nod in passing, the exchange of blankets at night. Evenings kept their own sacred space, the firelight glowing soft as they peeled back layers they'd long kept hidden. Shared stories came at their own pace, fragments of past joys, fractured histories, dreams perhaps better left locked away but offered now as fragile gifts. Gideon spoke of his days as a wagon driver, the miles he'd traveled, the loneliness that sometimes clung like a shadow. Beulah spoke less, but what she shared carried weight. The loss, the independence forged in hard silence, and the slow, unexpected opening toward something gentler. She never said the words, "I'm scared," aloud, but Gideon saw it in the way her eyes tightened when talk edged toward forever, and in how her fingers lingered just a moment longer, when her hands brushed, as if holding on to possibilities before letting go again. One evening, their shoulders just barely touching, as the fire dipped down to embers, Gideon reached for his worn leather hat and set it beside him. "Beulah," he murmured, voice thick with something between hope and caution, "there doesn't have to be a promise today, or a roadmap to the future. Just this. Now, and maybe tomorrow." She met his gaze, her gray-green eyes vast with something fierce and tender. The scar above her brow caught the last flicker of firelight like a beacon. Story in itself, a badge of battles past and strength earned. For a moment she hesitated, as if caught between worlds. And then slowly she gave a nod, not the hesitant kind, but one of quiet resolve. "Yes," she said softly, "just this." Now the pine-scented air carried their words into the night, weightless and sure, like the first flight of swallows returning to the nest. In the shared silences around the fire, amid the soft rustling of wind through budding branches, they found a steady heartbeat, two rhythms slowly sinking. In the space between work and rest, between the sunset and the promise of dawn. And it was enough. It was becoming more than enough. The road behind Beulah was as long and lonely as ever, marked by years of self-reliance, struggle, and lonesome miles. But here, in the scatter of wildflowers and worn leather, in the shared labor and quiet evenings, the road ahead shimmered with something new. Not a path she had to walk alone, but one she might choose to travel with another. Not yet a promise, but a beginning, a slow spring unfolding in all its wild, relentless beauty. Fire had burned low, leaving only smoldering embers clinging to the stubborn wood, when Beulah finally let the words slip out, quiet, almost fragile beneath the wide expanse of sky spilling in through the open door. "I don't want to leave again." Her voice was soft, barely louder than the night wind weaving through the pines. It was not a plea nor a demand, but a confession, laid bare in the hush between them. The words carried the weight of the long, hard miles she'd traveled, the years of dust and solitude pressing at her chest like a stone. Gideon turned slowly from the stove, where the last flicker of flames still wrestled with the cold, the warmth radiating faintly against his face. His sandy hair caught the ghostly light of the room, the peppering of gray, a quiet testament to stubborn endurance. His eyes held hers, slow and steady, and he gave a nod, not hurried or tentative, but deliberate and gentle, as if sealing a silent promise. No words followed, for none were needed. The nod spoke of understanding, of acceptance, of a patient kind of hope. In the stillness, the space between them softened. Beulah's hands, worn from grip and toil, rested on her lap, unclenching from the invisible tension they'd held for months. Gideon's calloused fingers brushed absently over the rim of his cup, then down to the worn leather hat beside him. They shared a moment carried by the quiet heartbeat of the cabin, the simple, unspoken acknowledgement that whatever lay ahead would be met not alone, but together. Her gray-green eyes glimmered, not with hesitation, but with a tender kind of surrender. And for the first time since that wagon broke on his road, Beulah felt a fragile warmth push through the shadowed doubts she'd carried, like armor. There was softness here. There was kindred quiet. Just that, No rhymes or reasons was enough. Asterisk that night, beneath the low slant of the moon, they began a small tradition born of unspoken need and patient knowing. After the fire was banked deep within the stove's belly, after hands were washed of dirt and work, they would place a carved wooden bird upon the mantel above the hearth. The first bird was simple, beechwood etched with delicate wings, each feather marked with care. Gideon had whittled it late into the night when sleep wouldn't come. The slow scrape of knife on wood mingling with the distant howl of coyotes. It was a bird of patience, he told her softly, a reminder that some things take time and that home is built grain by grain, moment by moment. Each evening thereafter, when the day's toil was done and the world outside settled into deep blue shadow, they carved another bird. Each had its own curve, its own gentle gesture towards the sky. Some were upright, proud, others doubled back in protective comfort, but always they landed in a quiet assembly on the rough-hewn mantel, a growing flock that carried their silent hopes. Beulah watched the collection grow with a strange pride. There was an unexpected sort of belonging in this simple ritual. Each bird spoke in a language without words, a promise of patience, of presence, of quiet, shared between two people who had learned at last to trust. Some nights neither spoke much. They just moved around the cabin, the scrape and tap of their tools mingling with the crackle from the stove and the distant murmur of earth settling into darkness. Sometimes Gideon would glance up at the birds, lips slightly parted in a slow smile, and Beulah would catch the look. Soft, steady, unyielding in its quiet strength. There on that mantel, those wooden birds were more than carved shapes. They became markers of a slower kind of love, unrushed, unforced, a gradual weaving of lives that neither had dared to hope for before. Asterisk months drifted by like the scout clouds overhead, the seasons folding one into the next. Spring bled into summer. Summer waned into the stark golden crimson of fall. And now winter's chill was setting in, the lined shack's stout walls creaking around them as cold gripped the land outside. This winter was different. Beulah was no longer the visitor who had wandered onto Gideon's road and into his solitary life. She had become part of the land itself, woven into the rhythms of the shack, the wild expanse, the seasons that bit with cold and bloomed with fierce, relentless beauty. Her hands were as much at home with the stove's iron grip as they were with the whip of the wagon's reins or the scrub of a stubborn boot. The faint scar above her brow caught the morning light like a badge of battle survived. But beneath that hardened exterior was a steady pulse of belonging that startled her sometimes in its quiet insistence. She sat by the stove with Gideon on a slow afternoon, watching the low heat paint the room in amber. Outside, the wind scattered snowflakes like drifted feathers, settling soft and pure upon the barren earth and pines heavy with frost. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of pine smoke, and the faint sweetness of drying herbs hung from the rafters. Gideon passed her a fresh cup of coffee, the steam curling upwards between them like an invitation. For a moment, their hands brushed as she took the cup, and the small contact pulled the warmth up through her bones stronger than the fire. "We'll get through this winter," Gideon said quietly, his voice weathered but firm. She nodded, the words settling deep and steady. This was no longer an arrangement of necessity, nor a temporary refuge from the road. It was real. It was hard-won and delicate, but it was hers. Their life, forged out of silence and steady work, the measured beat of shared mornings and evenings, and the scent of pine and coal ash forever imprinted on her skin. Somewhere between the howling wind and the worn wooden walls, Beulah stopped counting lonely nights. Asterisk. The last time the wind buffeted the small cabin, rattling shutters and hurrying clouds across the night sky, Gideon stood by the mantel with his carving knife poised over a pale slab of wood. The air was sharp and cold, the scent of winter spruce bleeding faintly in through the cracks. His hands moved sure and steady, carving the lines of a new bird, strong wings lifted in quiet grace. a silent herald of seasons past and those yet to come. He placed the finished bird carefully beside the others, a growing and now familiar collection of shapes and stories. His fingers lingered on the smooth curve before he stepped back. The firelight danced over the wood, tracing patterns that felt like home. Beulah watched from her chair, wrapped in a thick wool shawl. Her gaze rested on the little wooden bird, and then rose to meet Gideon's eyes. Steady, quiet, deeply soft. "This is ours now," he said, voice low in the stillness. It wasn't a declaration of grand promises or dramatic beginnings. It was the simple naming of fact, a tender acknowledgement of shared ground, shared time, and shared heart. She smiled, then slow, genuine, her gray-green eyes shimmering with something she hadn't dared to hope for once: peace. Here, amidst the quiet of timber and timberline, of whispered winds and steadfast hearth, Beulah finally allowed herself the rarest gift. Not a retreat into solitude, nor a hurried step toward something uncertain, but the deep, unshakable knowing that she was home. Wooden birds on the mantel watched silently as the last embers glowed low, as the night folded over the mountains, and as two lives, once separate roads, wound forward together. No longer bound by loneliness nor guarded distance, just two steady hearts learning the art of belonging. And in that gentle, patient quiet, Beulah felt the slow, sure unfolding of a life shared, and it was enough. More than enough. She leaned back as Gideon settled beside her, the air between them soft and full of trust, and let the silence speak. It had carried them here, after all. To the beginning, they both